Morning guys, Mr. Davis here. Hope you're well. I just wanted to go through this presentation with you on barriers to participation, and specifically this time looking to do with gender inequality in sport and the underrepresentation of women in sport and physical activity. So if you just make a note of the title and learning objective at the top of the page, and also the key terms there that you see in the box before we move on. So what we're looking at is the barriers that can prevent participation in sport, and then obviously the solutions which can be used to help overcome those barriers. We've looked at it already for disability groups, we've looked at it for ethnic minorities, and then the final group that we need to look at for this sort of thing is to do with women's sport. So here we go. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through a series of different barriers. Obviously you need to note down you need to note down the barrier that I've mentioned here and any additional information which is discussed. So first barrier, what you'll find with a lot of these is that they're very similar, often generic to the different groups that we've already looked at. So obviously you just need to tweak it slightly in terms of the wording, but the first one is the stereotypical myths. So the stereotypes that exist for women's sport and are still very much evident in society. So for example, the belief that women shouldn't be playing sport, that sport is maybe too aggressive and requires certain attributes that women just don't have. For example, playing in women's playing in rugby and things like that, or women using weights in gyms and things like that. So it's the stereotypical beliefs that exist in society preventing women from participating in sport. The second one is to do with media coverage. So whilst it is improving, there's still a considerable discrepancy between the level of men's media coverage and women. And even though there are certain activities like netball and football and women's boxing and women's golf, which are, you know, significantly on the rise, particularly on channels like Sky Sports, the overall level is still nowhere near what men's sport is, and that obviously presents quite a significant barrier. There's been various different studies and things. You won't need to quote any of them or any of the specific statistics, but just to give you an idea on recent studies that were done on the amount of women's sport on specific channels, it amounted to something like 5% of the total amount of sport being shown based on women's sport, which is obviously nothing compared to the men. Okay, third one. Now this one is all just to do with role models and the lack of suitable role models for women in sport, whether it's to do with performers, whether it's coaches or officials or people, you know, in positions of authority within the sport, making decisions in national governing bodies and things like that. You know, there's still a significant gap there in terms of women in those positions that young girls can look up to and be inspired by and aspire to take on those particular roles. And when they do, sometimes it's often it's not quite the correct sort of image that the media are portraying, particularly in terms of like body shape, and the idea that in the media often the body shape that is promoted that is kind of ideal for women is slightly at odds with what you might see in some of these pictures for someone like Serena Williams, who's very muscular and very strong. Some of the girls that are involved in kind of combat sports or any sort of team sports, even things like gymnastics, you know, a woman's body in gymnastics is very strong and quite defined and muscular. And that isn't quite matched up to what the media would have young girls believe is like what the ideal body to be, which is essentially quite skinny, you know, very little excess muscle or fat. So there's kind of two phases to that, just a lack of people in those key positions, but also the images that are portrayed in the media are at slightly at odds with what women's sport actually reflects. Right, next one is to do with sponsorship and the fewer sponsorship opportunities that exists for women in sport, and fewer opportunities to become, you know, full-time performers and full-time athletes. Without that side of things, without the money, without the investment, it becomes very difficult for girls to, no matter how much they enjoy the sport, it becomes very difficult for them to take it on in a meaningful role. And whilst it is changing and there is an increased level of investment, it's still nowhere near the level that men's sport enjoys, and that obviously then has a major impact on participation levels. So yeah, fewer sponsorship opportunities and fewer opportunities for women to take on a more professional role in the sports that they enjoy doing. Right, the next one is a huge one, and it's to do with the impact and the continued sort of negative impact of school sport and PE programs. There's so many different aspects to this, but whether it's to do with the lack of the range of activities that might be on offer, it might be to do with the facilities, it might be to do with the particular teachers, it might be to do with channeling girls into certain sports that, you know, stereotypically they might have once participated in, but more more recently that's maybe not the case, and it's not accurate to say that girls just want to play netball and just want to do gymnastics. It's actually loads of different things, whether it's football, rugby, cricket, basketball, and it might be some of those sports that they traditionally like to do. But it's that there are issues there with the sort of the range and the quality of the teaching. Often it's, you know, in some schools it's maybe that girls aren't the primary focus for the sport, and it's actually boys that generate that kind of focus. A major one is to do with like the change in facilities as well. And it's easy just to overlook this and dismiss it as not being important. But when studies have been done, it's right up there at the very top of the list of things that put girls and women off sport. Is the quality and the cleanliness of changing facilities. And it's just not, if it's not a pleasant environment to change in, and it doesn't have certain facilities that girls would want when they're coming and taking part in sport, particularly afterwards, whether it's to do with like shower facilities and things like that, mirrors in the changing rooms. Again, it's easy to dismiss the importance of that, but that is having a major impact on participation levels in sport. The other element to that is the kind of the progression pathways from girls' sport. There's a massive drop-off when girls leave school, and you can't pinpoint that directly on the doorstep of the schools, but part of the responsibility of schools and PE departments is to ensure a more lifelong participation. And there's a huge drop-off in participation of girls' sport from when they leave school to like the years ahead. And there's lots of different reasons for that, but schools need to do a better job of making sure that girls are participating in sports, not just from the age of 11 to 18, but what they're actually going to do after that. So there's a lack of progression pathways beyond school is something that needs to be addressed as well. Right, next one is just to do with potentially like a lack of fitness, a lack of self-confidence, body image issues. And this kind of links into some of the points that we raised earlier about, you know, how the media presents certain images of women in sport, and that's slightly at odds with what the stereotypical view of what a women's body should look like, in terms of just being very skinny. And that's not often what women's athletes, the bodies of women's athletes actually looks like, but just a more fundamental lack of fitness, particularly if women have you know, had children and had families and that sort of thing. That can then play quite a significant impact on their fitness levels, and it's quite difficult to come back from something like that, where your body has gone through such a kind of traumatic experience, if you like, with putting on lots of weight. And it's really difficult to shift your mindset and shift your focus back towards being on fitness and having like what is a healthy body. Often if you're quite self-confident, lacking that self-confidence, you know, if you've put on a few pounds and you've got a few curves all over, you might not want to go to the gym. You might not want to put yourself in a tight costume and go and sit in front of lots of people on an exercise bike. So it's those body image issues and that self-confidence that plays quite a significant role in preventing women from maybe getting involved in sport. Right, next one is just to do with, it kind of links into the last one, but rather than just looking at body image and kind of self-confidence, it's more to do with just the lack of leisure time. So when women take on, whether it's to do with work or whether it's to do with family commitments, the lack of leisure time is significant. If you just don't have the time to participate in the sport because you've got work, family commitments, childcare issues, it becomes difficult to find the time to actually engage in sport. And while there are various different programs and different things that are promoted that women can do, whether it's joining a club or simply like going for a run with your child, that's not, it's easier said than done. That's not an easy thing to suddenly just build into your routine. So a lack of leisure time can present quite a significant barrier to women for various different reasons. Another one is to do with lack of disposable income. And again, it's a kind of knock-on effect of maybe having a family and maybe the burden of financially not being able to involve yourself in lots of different sports and pay memberships and pay your equipment and clothing and shoes and all of that sort of thing. It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing for anyone, but it's one of the potential barriers that you can list for women having a lower level of participation in sport, the lack of disposable income. Another one is this idea of channeling. We mentioned it before when we were looking at ethnic minorities and also disability groups. You know, we said before, when in PE, girls are often channeled or pushed into certain sports and maybe not given the opportunity to take part in other sports that are stereotypically or traditionally not set up for women to play. And whilst it is changing and improving, there's still an idea that girls get involved in sports which are deemed to be female appropriate and suitable for women to play. And it's often not the sports that require extra physicality and extra strength, and you're more likely to get muddy and potentially hurt. Those aren't the sort of sports that are still being promoted for girls on the whole. It's still, you know, looking at things like gymnastics and swimming and hockey and netball. And whilst it is changing, it's still got some way to go. Right. Final one is just to do with the provision of different leagues, competitions, clubs. Again, almost all of these, you could say it is improving, but it's not quite where it should be yet, and it's certainly not on a par with men's sport. So at an elite level, you're starting to see quite a lot of, at the very high end of the game, you know, there are now leagues and clubs and competitions for women in netball, in football, in cricket, in rugby, loads of different sports, but that doesn't necessarily filter down into, you know, the wider level of participation if you're not an elite athlete. And generally, lots of these clubs will have teams and have competitions set up, particularly in the team games like football and rugby and cricket, basketball. They will have lots and lots of men's teams, but it might not be that they have any women's teams at all. Or if they do, it might be one team, or it might be that they have a youth team, but they don't have a team that the girls can progress into as a women's team. So it's a lack of leagues, a lack of competitions, and a lack of clubs that provide women with opportunity to take part in sport. Those are all, and then there are other barriers, but those are the significant barriers that you need to be aware of. Right, and then we come to the solutions. So for each one of those, some of them are very obvious. And as we go through, it's simply a case of boosting the levels that you might see with each of those factors. But there are certain other things that you should be aware of as well. So one of them is to do with the introduction and enforcement of certain laws. So for instance, this one, the Sex Discrimination Act 1975, and this is a more general thing, but that has a huge impact on society. So it's making sure that sexual discrimination is unlawful in any sphere of life, and that includes kind of the aspects of kind of the world of sport, and that's just trying to improve the way that women are seen, not just in sport but in general. And if you can boost the more general way that girls and women are seen in society and their status in society, that is obviously going to filter into areas that are significant for us, which is obviously sport and physical activity. So there's things like Sexual Discrimination Act 1975, which aims to kind of put women on an even level and break down those very kind of robust and traditional barriers that exist in society. Right, next one is to do with improving the kind of the general social acceptance of women in terms of having jobs and having careers and having money that's available to then be able to be independent and get into sport. If women are just channeled into certain careers, or not even careers, but just positions in society in terms of maybe being the mum, being the stay-at-home mum, then that doesn't then enable them to go out and be independent and earn a living and earn money that can then enable them to go and take part in sport. So whilst you might think that having a job is actually in kind of a conflict to the interest of going and taking part in sport, men have jobs, men have that freedom and that independence to go and do that sort of thing, and it's improving women's ability to do that sort of thing as well, which is quite significant. Right, the next one is important because this is something that's you start to see quite a lot of, and it's that ability to ensure that women have better childcare facilities and provision, maybe in the places where they are going to go and do sport. So things like a creche, which is like a little place, essentially like a short-term nursery, attached to fitness centres and gyms and leisure centres and swimming pools, where they can know that their child is nearby and is being well looked after. And it's not a case of, I can't go to the gym because I don't have childcare. So providing those sorts of improved facilities make sure that women are able to overcome the kind of the barrier of time and the worry that maybe they have to choose between their child and the physical activity and the sport they want to engage in. And obviously the children are likely to come first, but by providing opportunities like this, where these creches and these childcare facilities are integrated within the gyms and the fitness places, that makes it a lot easier. Right, next one, to do with media coverage. Now we've said there was a lack of media coverage, so the obvious thing to do is improve the media coverage of women's sport. Give them that platform, give international sport the recognition, showcase the different activities, the different high levels of performance that are being given to women in sport. Put those role models on the screen for young girls to see and be inspired by. It's changing. It's not what it it's much better than it used to be. It's not where it could be or where it should be in terms of on a level playing field for men, but it's much better than it used to be. And by continuing to drive media coverage in women's sport, that's going to have a significant impact on participation levels. Right, next one in a similar way is the increase in sponsorship. So before we were saying there was an issue with lack of sponsorship and lack of money being provided for women in sport. Well, by improving that, by making sure that these elite teams and these clubs and these leagues and these individual performers are getting that sort of sponsorship, that's going to enable them to take part in far more sport, particularly at a higher level. But it will also inspire young girls to think that there's a career path there for them, into a kind of an elite level of sport, which maybe they wouldn't have been when they were 10-15 years ago. We just think that's not something that I can actually pursue into an elite level. Next one is to do with the improvement in kind of physical education and in school sport. So by trying to break down those barriers, that there are only certain sports that girls can play in, and that PE is very much more for the boys than it is for the girls. There's various different programs that the Women's FA, that Sport England, and that organisations like the WSFF, which are groups of campaigning for women's sport. And there's something called Changing the Game for Girls. So essentially, it's a toolkit that's provided that schools and PE departments can try and follow to improve girls' sport. So it's improving physical education, it's improving the participation levels for sport at that lower level to get more girls inspired and interested in sport. All right, next one is to do with the sort of provision, not just in schools, but beyond that, more opportunities for women to take part in sports, in clubs, in leisure centres and that sort of thing. There's various different things they could do. They could make them specifically geared towards women. They can have specific times when only women can attend. They can provide a range of activities that women are maybe more likely to engage with. They can improve, it says here, shower facilities. It's all of that sort of thing that is potentially going to engage women in sport beyond school. So I mentioned that before, there was a huge drop off, but it's this sort of provision that's going to have a major impact. So the opportunities and the improvement in facilities is going to have a big impact on women's sport. The change in facilities, like this is listed as one of the key things that women really dislike about going to these swimming pools and leisure centres and gyms and fitness places, that the changing rooms are often dirty, they're quite small and crowded, and there's not good shower facilities, and it's that sort of thing. If you can change that, whilst it might not appear to men to be a significant barrier, for women it's something that is a major thing that needs to be improved, and where you can get a facility that offers a much better provision, that's obviously going to boost participation levels. Okay, the next one is to do with this idea of social networking and trying to use the improved modern day social network methods to make sure that women are sharing positive messages about sport. They can kind of create friendships and develop positive relationships with people, and essentially creating a kind of network where it drives more girls to take part in sport. And finally, you've got the idea that women's sport can be shared and promoted. Right, sorry about that, guys, just a short interruption. This one was just to do with the range of activities that that women can participate in. So previously, maybe not having that wide range of activities, just being channeled in towards the traditional stereotypical sports. This is just ensuring that women have a wide range of activities. That's going to, obviously, if they've got more activities that are potentially going to be able to participate in, more women are then going to be able to take part in sport, whether it's to do with gym-based stuff, whether it's to do with kind of new activities that maybe they haven't been made available to them before, or whether it's to do with team games and things like that. That's going to have a huge impact on improving participation levels. I think that is the final one. It is. So what you need to make sure of is you've got that list down of all the different barriers and the additional information to do with things that prevent and limit participation levels of women's sport, but then also the solutions for each one. There are other things as well that you can consider, and you can look at some of the statistical information on Sport England websites about women's participation in sport. I'll also provide you with a range of exam questions that you can make sure that you can channel that information in towards making your answers, clear and coherent for an actual genuine exam question rather than just general chit chat. But that is the presentation for today. Hopefully you found that useful, and I shall see you soon. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.